Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Calm Before. Gary Robinson had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous threat wasn't the one screaming in your face. It was the one watching from the shadows, waiting for you to drop your guard. He stood in his garage workshop, sanding down a piece of oak for the bookshelf he'd been building for Samantha's apartment. The rhythmic motion calmed his mind, a meditation he developed over 17 years teaching hand-to-hand combat to Marine Recon. Those years had carved discipline into his bones, but they'd also cost him. A failed marriage when Samantha was 12, his ex-wife Eleanor remarrying and moving to Seattle, leaving him to raise their daughter alone through her teenage years. Not that he'd minded. Samantha was the one person who made sense of the chaos he'd seen in 2 tours overseas before transitioning to instructor duty at Camp Pendleton. "Dad!" Samantha's voice cracked from the doorway. Gary looked up. His daughter stood there in sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her auburn hair pulled back, but he could see the purple shadow under her left eye that makeup couldn't quite hide. His jaw tightened. "He hit you again." It wasn't a question. This was the 3rd time in 2 months. Rex Swanson, 24, 6'2", 200 pounds of entitlement wrapped in a mechanic's coveralls. They'd broken up 5 weeks ago, but Rex couldn't accept it. The restraining order Samantha had filed seemed to only fuel his obsession. "I was leaving the library," Samantha said, her voice small. "He was waiting by my car." Started yelling about how I embarrassed him, how his friends are laughing at him. I tried to get past him, and he grabbed my arm, shook me. When I pulled away, he backhanded me. Gary set down the sandpaper, his movements deliberate, controlled. "Did you call the police?" "They sent Officer Campos. He took a report, but..." She trailed off, and they both knew the rest. Sheriff Dan Swanson ran this county like his personal kingdom. His son had been arrested twice for assault, once in high school, once at 21, and both times the charges had mysteriously disappeared. "I want you staying here until we figure this out," Gary said. "Not at your apartment." "Dad, I can't let him. You're staying here." His tone left no room for argument. "I'm calling Jake Edwards tomorrow morning. He's a lawyer in San Diego now. Owes me a favor. We're going to document everything and build a case so tight even Dan Swanson can't wiggle his son out of it." What Gary didn't say, what he kept locked behind the tactical part of his brain that never fully shut off, was that Rex Swanson exhibited every warning sign of an escalating abuser. The violence was increasing, the obsession intensifying, and men like Rex, when they finally snapped, didn't come to talk. They came to eliminate. That night, Gary barely slept. He lay in bed, listening to every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside. His mind ran through scenarios, threat assessments, defensive positions. His .45 sat in the nightstand, loaded, safety off. Years ago, his ex-wife Eleanor had hated that he kept weapons ready. But Eleanor had never seen what he'd seen, never had to understand that violence wasn't something you could wish away with restraining orders and good intentions. Sometimes violence only understood violence. Around 2 a.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered without speaking. Heavy breathing on the other end, then a slurred voice. "You think you can keep her from me, old man? You're just like her, thinking you're better than me. My dad told me what you really are. A washed-up jarhead who teaches boys how to throw punches. When I come for her, what are you going to do? Talk me to death about discipline and honor. Rex, drunk or high? Probably both. You come near my daughter again," Gary said quietly, "and you'll discover exactly what 17 years training Recon Marines means." "Is that a threat? You threatening me? I'm recording this, asshole. My dad will have your..." Gary hung up. Let the kid have his recording. Let Sheriff Dan hear it. Gary had made no actionable threat, just stated a fact. But the call confirmed what he'd suspected. This was about to escalate. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, walked through the house checking locks, windows, sightlines. The house sat on 2 acres outside Meridian Falls, California, a town of 12,000 tucked in the hills 40 minutes from San Diego. Good fields of fire from the porch, but also isolated. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. Back in his room, Gary opened his closet and moved aside old Marine Corps uniforms to reveal a locked case. Inside, His K-bar knife, the one he'd carried for 20 years. 3 magazines for his .45, and a small notebook filled with contact information. Marines he'd trained, men who'd gone on to special operations, law enforcement, private security. If Sheriff Dan Swanson wanted to play games, Gary Robinson had an entire network of highly trained killers who still called him Gunny. Chapter 2, 45 seconds. 3 nights later, at 11:47 p.m., Gary woke to the sound of breaking glass. His hand found the .45 before his eyes fully opened, years of training overriding the grogginess of sleep. He moved to his bedroom door in bare feet, listening. Downstairs, kitchen window. One person, heavy footsteps, moving fast but clumsy, drunk or amped on adrenaline. Samantha's room was across the hall. He opened her door silently. Sam, closet. Now, don't come out until I come get you. She bolted upright, saw the gun in his hand, and didn't argue. Years of her father's careful lessons had taught her when to ask questions and when to obey instantly. Gary moved to the staircase. The living room was dark, but streetlight through the front windows cast shadows. A figure emerged from the kitchen, tall, broad-shouldered, holding something in his right hand that caught the light. A knife, 8-inch blade, probably from his own kitchen. Samantha. Rex Swanson's voice echoed through the house. Get down here. We're going to talk. We're going to fix this. Gary descended 3 steps, enough to be visible, keeping the high ground. He held the .45 down at his side, finger outside the trigger guard. Rex, you need to leave. Right now. Rex's head snapped up. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated. Definitely high on something. This is your fault. You turned her against me. You poisoned her mind. The police are already on their way. Gary lied smoothly. You leave now. Maybe you can avoid felony charges. Fuck the police. You think I'm scared? My dad IS the police. Rex started up the stairs, knife raised. You're just a washed-up jarhead. You can't protect her. Nobody can protect her from me. This was the moment. The decision point that separated civilians from warriors. Rex was armed, threatening, clearly intent on violence. Gary had every legal right to shoot him. Center mass, 2 rounds, and the threat. But Gary Robinson hadn't spent 17 years teaching Marines how to be lethal just to rely on a firearm when his hands would send a stronger message. He set the .45 on the stair behind him. What are you doing? Rex laughed, a manic edge to it. You giving up? No, Gary said, walking down toward him. I'm giving you a choice. Drop the knife. Walk out. This ends tonight one way or another, but you get to decide which way. Rex lunged. The knife came up in a wild arc, the kind of attack that worked on scared teenagers and unprepared victims. Gary sidestepped, his left hand snapping out to catch Rex's wrist, controlling the weapon. His right hand drove into Rex's elbow. Not enough to break it, just enough to hyperextend it, making Rex's grip spasm. The knife clattered to the hardwood floor. Rex threw a wild left hook. Telegraphed. Slow. Gary slipped it, drove his palm into Rex's solar plexus, folding him forward. Then came the lessons, the techniques he'd drilled into hundreds of Marines. Control the head, control the body. His right arm wrapped around Rex's neck in a rear naked choke, textbook perfect, cutting off blood flow to the brain. Rex thrashed, tried to elbow him, but Gary had already swept his legs, taking them both to the floor with Gary on top, controlling everything. You're going to sleep now, Gary said calmly. When you wake up, this is over. Rex's thrashing weakened. His hands clawed at Gary's forearm, unable to break the grip. 10 seconds. 15. His body went limp. Gary released the choke, rolled Rex onto his stomach, and bound his hand with a zip tie from his pocket. Old habit. Always carry basic restraints. He checked Rex's pulse. Steady. Breathing. Regular. Unconscious, but fine. Then Gary saw the damage. When they'd gone to the floor, Rex's momentum had carried him forward even as Gary controlled the descent. His lower back had impacted the edge of the 4th stair, right on the spine, and then the weight of both their bodies on that single point of impact. Rex's legs weren't moving right. Even unconscious, there should be reflexive twitches, but they lay still at odd angles. Shit, Gary muttered. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911. This is Gary Robinson, 2847 Oak Canyon Road. I have an intruder, subdued, unconscious, possible spinal injury. Send paramedics and police. Samantha appeared at the top of the stairs. Dad, stay up there. Don't come down. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. Gary timed it. Christy Bowman and her partner Luis, the regular county EMTs, professionals who didn't ask questions, just worked. They examined Rex, called for a spine board, started asking Gary technical questions about the takedown. Impact to L2, L3 region, Gary said. His full weight plus mine, maybe 220 combined pounds, compressed over the stair edge. I tried to control the descent, but he was fighting it. Christy met his eyes. She'd treated enough Marines over the years to know what Gary was. A man who understood anatomy and physics in ways that could save lives or end them. He's paralyzed below the waist. Complete loss of motor function. We're looking at permanent damage, Mr. Robinson. 45 seconds. From the moment Rex lunged to the moment he'd never walk again. 45 seconds. As they loaded Rex into the ambulance, Gary saw headlights coming up his driveway. Not a patrol car, a black Chevy Tahoe with a light bar. Sheriff's personal vehicle. Sheriff Dan Swanson stepped out, 58 years old, 6 feet tall, running to fat, but still imposing in his tan uniform. His face was stone. Gary Robinson? Sheriff, you just paralyzed my son. Your son broke into my home with a knife, threatening my daughter. I defended my family. Dan stepped closer. In the flashing lights of the ambulance, his eyes were flat, cold. You're going to jail. Excessive force. Assault with intent. I'll make sure you never see daylight again. Gary didn't flinch. I acted within my rights. Castle doctrine. Stand your ground. And I have 17 years of expert testimony to prove every move was controlled and defensive. You think I give a shit about doctrine? Dan's voice dropped to a whisper. You cripple my boy. That's all I need to know. Then arrest me, Gary said. Right here, in front of the paramedics, in front of my daughter, in front of everyone. Let's see how that plays in court. Dan stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Christy. What happened here? Christy's answer was textbook neutral. Home invasion, intruder subdued by homeowner, spinal injury consistent with impact trauma during struggle. Dan's jaw clenched. He looked back at Gary. This isn't over. Not even close. No, Gary agreed. I don't expect it is. The sheriff left with the ambulance, and Gary stood in his driveway. Adrenaline finally starting to fade, replaced by the grim certainty that he'd just made an enemy who wore a badge and had 30 years of connections to men who enforced laws or broke them for a living. Chapter 3. Lines in the Sand. The first 48 hours passed quietly. Too quietly. Gary knew Dan Swanson was regrouping, planning. Men like Dan didn't respond immediately when angry. They calculated, called in favors, built their strategy. On the third morning, Jake Edwards arrived from San Diego. 36, former Marine Corps JAG officer, now a criminal defense attorney specializing in self-defense cases. He'd been one of Gary's students at Pendleton, a cocky lieutenant who'd learned respect the hard way when Gary had put him on his back 17 times in one session. Gunny, Jake said, shaking hands in Gary's kitchen. Hell of a situation. Tell me the law, Gary said. Jake spread out paperwork on the table. California Castle doctrine is solid. Homeowner has the right to use reasonable force to repel an intruder. Rex broke in, had a weapon, made explicit threats. Your use of force was defensive, not punitive. Spinal injury was accidental result of defensive actions. Dan Swanson's a problem. Understatement. Jake pulled out his laptop, showed Gary a file he'd compiled. Sheriff Daniel Swanson. Elected 4 times, running unopposed in the last 2 elections. His department has the highest complaint rate in the county, but somehow those complaints never go anywhere. I pulled records, 6 excessive force allegations against his deputies in the last 3 years. All cleared by internal investigation, meaning he buries them. Exactly. And there's more. Jake clicked through files. Rex has 3 assault charges in his history. First one at 17, beat up a classmate, settle out of court, record sealed because he was a minor. Second at 21, bar fight, put a guy in a hospital. Charges dropped after the victim suddenly refused to testify. Third time was 8 months ago, domestic incident with a girlfriend before Samantha. She filed charges, then withdrew them a week later. Dan intimidated her. Can't prove it, but yes, almost certainly. So we're dealing with a pattern. Violent son, corrupt father who shields him. And now the son is paralyzed, and the father has the resources of an entire sheriff's department to come after you. Samantha joined them, carrying coffee. What do we do? Jake looked at Gary. The legal answer is we document everything, file our own report, prepare for any charges Dan might bring. I've got a former FBI agent, a woman named Valerie Hodge, who works as a private investigator now. She can help us build a case. And the practical answer? Gary asked. Dan Swanson will come at you sideways. He can't arrest you outright. Too many witnesses, too clean a self-defense case. But he can make your life hell. Traffic stops, code enforcement, harass your friends, your neighbors. He'll look for any violation, any excuse. As if summoned, there was a knock at the door. Gary opened it to find Officer Bill Campos, one of the deputies who'd responded the night of the break-in. Mr. Robinson, Campos said, I need you to come down to the station. Sheriff wants to ask you some questions. About what? Jake stepped forward. I'm his attorney. My client already gave a statement the night of the incident. Campos looked uncomfortable. New evidence. I can't say more. But if he doesn't come voluntarily, I have a warrant. Gary and Jake exchanged glances. Show me the warrant, Jake said. Campos handed it over. Jake scanned it, his jaw tightening. This is bullshit. Probable cause based on additional evidence obtained during crime scene investigation. What evidence? You'll find out at the station. They drove separately to the Meridian Falls Sheriff's Department, a low brick building on Main Street. Inside, Sheriff Dan Swanson waited in an interview room, another deputy, Norman Phillips, a hard-faced man in his 40s, standing by the door. Mr. Robinson, Dan said, voice professionally neutral. Thank you for coming. I've been reviewing the evidence from the incident at your home, and some things don't add up. Jake sat next to Gary. My client acted in self-defense. We've been through this. I'm not disputing the break-in, Dan said, but I am questioning the level of force used. See, we found something interesting during our investigation. He slid a photo across the table. This knife, found in your son's bedroom, not at the scene. Gary looked at the photo. It was a different knife, a hunting blade, larger than what Rex had grabbed from the kitchen. That's not, Samantha started to say, but Jake cut her off with a hand on her arm. You're planting evidence, Jake said flatly. I'm following evidence, Dan replied. This knife matches wounds on my son's hands, defensive wounds. Suggests your client attacked him with a blade before the struggle. That's insane, Gary said calmly. Rex broke into my home with my kitchen knife. Your crime scene text documented it. It documented a knife at the scene. Doesn't mean it was the only knife involved. Dan leaned forward. Here's what I think happened, Robinson. You heard my son come in, grabbed your knife, went downstairs looking for a fight. You could have called 911, could have stayed in your room with your gun, waited for us to arrive. Instead, you engaged. You wanted to hurt him. The play was obvious. Reshape the narrative from clear self-defense to mutual combat, or worse, premeditated assault. Turn Gary from victim to aggressor. This is harassment, Jake said. You're angry your son is paralyzed, and you're using your badge to go after my client. We're done here. Not quite. Dan nodded to Phillips, who stepped forward with handcuffs. Gary Robinson, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. You have the right to remain silent. Jake was already on his phone as they cuffed Gary. Judge Hartman owes me a favor. We'll have you out in 6 hours. As they led him to the holding cells, Dan leaned close. You should have stayed upstairs, Marine. Should have called us, let us handle it. Instead, you got clever. Now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with my family. Gary met his eyes. And you're about to learn what happens when you threaten mine. In the holding cell, Gary sat on the concrete bench and did what he'd trained himself to do: assess, plan, execute. Dan Swanson had just made this personal, escalated it beyond a simple home invasion. The man was corrupt, had been for years, and now he had motivation to burn everything down. But Gary Robinson had 17 years of connections to men who specialized in precision operations. Marines who'd gone into federal law enforcement, FBI, DEA, Homeland Security. And he had something Dan didn't: patience forged in combat and a tactical mind that thought 3 moves ahead. Dan Swanson wanted a war. He just declared it on the wrong man. Jake got him out in 4 hours. Judge Faye Hartman, a no-nonsense woman who'd been on the bench for 20 years, had reviewed the evidence and released Gary on his own recognizance, calling Dan's arrest legally questionable at best. Back at the house, Gary found his garage workshop trashed, drawers overturned, tools scattered. They'd had a warrant to search the property, had been looking for the weapon Dan claimed Gary used. But in the chaos, they'd missed something. In the rafters above the workbench, tucked behind insulation, Gary kept a waterproof case. Inside, a burner phone, a notebook with contacts, and $20,000 in cash. Insurance, he called it. Every operator knew to maintain an emergency cache. He texted Jake, "Need Valerie Hodge here tomorrow. Time to go on offense." Then he texted another number, one he hadn't used in 3 years. "Corey, it's Robinson. Need a favor. Urgent." The reply came in 30 seconds. "Gunny. Anything. When and where?" Gary smiled, but there was no humor in it. Just cold calculation. Sheriff Dan Swanson thought he controlled this county. Thought he could use his badge to destroy anyone who crossed him. He was about to discover that some men don't play by civilian rules, and some fights can't be won by hiding behind a badge. Chapter 4, Reconnaissance. Valerie Hodge arrived at dawn, driving a nondescript gray sedan. 52 years old, former FBI white-collar crimes investigator, she'd left the bureau after butting heads with too many politicians who wanted cases buried. Now she ran a private investigation firm that specialized in exposing corruption. Gary had called in every favor he had to get her here. "Jake says you pissed off a dirty sheriff," Valerie said, spreading files across Gary's dining room table. "So I did some preliminary digging. Dan Swanson is dirty, all right, but he's smart about it. His financial records are clean, no unexplained income, no offshore accounts I can find. But his lifestyle doesn't match his salary." She showed him photos. Dan's house, a sprawling ranch-style property on 20 acres. His boat, a 40-foot cabin cruiser. His wife Marlene's jewelry at county functions. "Sheriff's salary is $85,000 a year," Valerie continued. "Marlene doesn't work. Their son Rex worked as a mechanic, made maybe $35,000. Yet they own property worth over $1 million, free and clear. Boat's another $150,000. Where's the money coming from?" "Bribes," Samantha said. She'd been listening from the kitchen doorway. "Has to be." "Yes, but from who? For what?" Valerie pulled up another file. "I looked at cases in this county over the last 10 years. Arrest rates are normal. Conviction rates slightly below average. But there's a pattern. Certain types of crimes never seem to get investigated thoroughly." "Like what?" Gary asked. "Drug trafficking. There have been 17 major drug busts in this county in the last decade, all small-time dealers. But the distribution network? Never touched. DEA requested assistance from the sheriff's department 3 times to investigate suspected suppliers. Each time, Dan's department claimed lack of evidence or jurisdiction issues." Gary leaned back. "He's protecting suppliers, taking payoffs to look the other way. That's my theory. But proving it requires evidence Dan has spent years burying." Valerie looked at Gary. "Jake told me you have resources. Military contacts. I need information from the inside. Someone in Dan's department willing to talk." Before Gary could answer, another car pulled up. A black pickup truck, lifted suspension, tactical gear in the back. Out stepped Corey Ware, 43, built like a linebacker, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent 20 years in special operations. He'd been one of Gary's best students, had gone on to Delta Force, then retired to run a security consulting firm. "Gunny," Corey said, embracing Gary. "Heard you got jammed up. Brought some friends." 2 more men emerged from the truck. Ryan Chong, former Marine Recon, now a licensed private investigator, and Michael Harris, ex-Navy SEAL, current DOJ liaison. "Christ," Valerie muttered. You called in the Special Operations Alumni Association. Not exactly, Gary said. Just friends who understand that sometimes the law isn't enough. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Michael confirmed that the FBI had been watching Sheriff Dan Swanson for 3 years, suspected corruption, but never had enough for a case. The key was finding his connection to the drug pipeline. Prove that, and federal charges would follow. There's a deputy, Michael said, checking his notes. Ed Matthews. 15 years on the force, clean record, but he put in for a transfer to San Diego County 6 months ago. Application was denied by Dan personally. I can reach out through official channels, see if he's willing to talk. Do it, Gary said. But carefully. If Dan finds out we're recruiting his people, he'll retaliate. Speaking of retaliation, Jake interjected, we've got a preliminary hearing on your assault charge in 2 weeks. Judge Hartman is presiding, which is good for us, but Dan will bring everything he's got. Samantha had been quiet, absorbing everything. Now she spoke up. What about Rex? Could he testify against his father? Everyone looked at her. Think about it, she continued. Rex is paralyzed because his father covered for him his whole life. Never made him face consequences, never got him help. He's 24 years old, stuck in a wheelchair, looking at decades of physical therapy and limitations. Maybe he's angry. Maybe he'd talk. Valerie nodded slowly. It's a long shot, but worth exploring. Where's he now? County Hospital, Gary said. They moved him from ICU to a recovery ward 3 days ago. I'll see if I can get in, Ryan said. Former Marine with a spinal injury wants to talk to another guy with mobility issues, offer support. Might get past the guards Dan probably is posted. The plan was taking shape. Gather evidence of Dan's corruption, find allies inside his department, potentially flip his own son against him. But Gary knew Dan wouldn't sit idle while they worked. He was right. That afternoon, a code enforcement officer arrived at Gary's door. Willard Pratt, a nervous man in his 50s who clearly didn't want to be there. Mr. Robinson, I've received complaints about unpermitted structures on your property. I need to conduct an inspection. Gary stepped aside. Come in. Willard spent an hour documenting violations. The workshop Gary had built 5 years ago allegedly didn't have proper permits. It did, but mysteriously the county claimed they couldn't find the records. The deck was structurally unsound. It wasn't. The septic system needed immediate inspection. It had been inspected and cleared 6 months ago. Each violation came with fines totaling $25,000 if not corrected within 30 days. This is harassment, Gary said calmly. I'm just doing my job, Willard replied, but he couldn't meet Gary's eyes. After he left, Jay called. They're hitting you from every angle. I just got notification that your concealed carry permit is under review for recent behavioral concerns. And the DMV flagged your truck registration for an emissions test, even though you just passed one 3 months ago. Dan's making it expensive to fight back, Gary said. That's the idea. He wants you broke, stressed, and too busy dealing with bureaucratic bullshit to investigate him. Jake paused. We can fight each of these, but it'll take time and money. Then we accelerate our timeline, Gary said. How long until Michael can get Ed Matthews to talk? Working on it. Should hear back tonight. At 9 p.m., Michael called. Matthews will meet. Tomorrow night, off duty. But he's scared, says Dan has eyes everywhere. Tell him we'll keep him safe, Gary said. And tell him this is his chance to do the right thing. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Foundation. Deputy Ed Matthews sat across from Gary in a booth at a diner 40 miles outside Meridian Falls, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Mid-30s, thinning hair, the kind of guy who joined the force to help people and got ground down by the realities of corrupt leadership. I don't know what you think I can tell you, Ed said. The truth, Gary replied. About Sheriff Swanson. About what really happens in that department. Ed laughed bitterly. The truth? The truth is Dan Swanson runs this county like the mob. You don't cross him, you don't question him. You take your paycheck, you look the other way, and you survive. But you try to transfer out. Because I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't stand by while Ed stopped, shook his head. About a wife. 2 kids. Dan made it clear that if I keep pushing, if I talk to the wrong people, bad things could happen to my family. Valerie, sitting next to Gary, leaned forward. We can protect you. Federal witness protection if necessary. But we need specifics. Names, dates, incidents. Ed stared at his coffee for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. I kept records. Encrypted files, backed up to a cloud drive Dan doesn't know about. Dates when evidence disappeared from lockup. Case files I got buried. Times when Dan ordered deputies to stand down on investigations. He swiped through his phone, stopped on a photo. This is Cameron Whitney. Drug dealer, got popped with 2 kilos of fentanyl 18 months ago. Open and shut case. But the evidence got lost during transfer to county lockup. Case dismissed. Whitney walked. Not only walked, but 3 months later I saw him at Dan's house. They were having a barbecue, laughing like old friends. Valerie was taking notes furiously. You have proof of this connection? Photos, dates, witness statements from other deputies who saw it. But here's the thing. Cameron isn't the supplier. He's the distributor. The real money comes from higher up the chain. Someone's bringing fentanyl and meth into this county by the truckload, and Dan makes sure they never get caught. Ooh, Gary asked. I don't know. That's the truth. Dan keeps that information tight. Only his inner circle knows. Norman Phillips, maybe 1 or 2 others. But I know where you might find answers. Ed pulled up another photo. A warehouse on the outskirts of town, near the industrial district. This building. Officially, it's owned by a shell company, registered to an address that doesn't exist. But I've seen Dan's personal vehicle there late at night. 3 times in the last year, always around 2 a.m., always alone. Gary and Valerie exchanged glances. What's your theory? Valerie asked. I think that's where they store product. Maybe where they coordinate distribution. I wanted to get a warrant, surveil it properly, but when I mentioned it to my lieutenant, he shut me down hard. Said I was chasing shadows, wasting department resources. Next week, I found a dead rat in my locker with a note. Rats get exterminated. Gary felt the familiar cold focus settle over him. The same feeling he'd get before a mission brief, when all the pieces started clicking into place. Ed, if we can prove what's in that warehouse, would you testify? Against Dan? In court. Ed looked terrified. That's suicide. Not if we do this right. Not if we have federal protection and evidence so overwhelming that Dan goes down before he can retaliate. Gary leaned forward. You joined a force to protect people. This is your chance to do that. But I need you all in. Ed closed his eyes, then nodded. Okay, I'm in. What do you need me to do? Stay close to your family. Document everything Dan does from here on out. And when we make our move, be ready to testify. Back at Gary's house, the team assembled. Corey had conducted a reconnaissance of the warehouse Ed mentioned, confirmed it was rarely occupied, minimal security, definitely suspicious for a supposedly abandoned building. We need to get inside, Ryan said. See what they're hiding. That's breaking and entering, Jake pointed out. Anything we find would be inadmissible. Unless we find probable cause for the FBI to get a warrant, Michael countered. I photographed something incriminating through a window. That's not illegal. That gives us grounds for a proper warrant, proper search. It's risky, Valerie said. If Dan finds out we're onto the warehouse, he'll clean it out. Gary stood at the window, looking out at his property. 2 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been building furniture for his daughter. Now he was planning covert operations against a corrupt law enforcement officer. But that's what leadership meant, making hard calls when the system failed. We do it tomorrow night, Gary said. Corey, Ryan, you're with me. Michael, you stay back with the camera, official observer, federal witness. Valerie, you coordinate with your FBI contacts, have them standing by in case we find something actionable. What about me? Samantha asked. You stay here with Jake. If this goes sideways, you're the priority. Gary looked at his daughter. I promised your mother I'd keep you safe. I'm not breaking that promise. The next night, Gary, Corey, and Ryan approached the warehouse at 1 a.m., dressed in dark clothing, faces covered. Michael waited in a vehicle a block away with a high-powered camera and audio recording equipment. Everything documented, everything legal from his position as a federal observer. The warehouse was a squat concrete building, no windows on the lower floor, a few high ventilation panels near the roof. Single entrance, padlocked. Corey had the lock picked in 30 seconds. Inside, the smell hit them first. Chemicals, cleaning agents, and underneath it, the distinctive acrid scent of methamphetamine. Gary had smelled it before, during drug interdiction operations overseas. The main floor held stacks of wooden pallets, industrial shelving, nothing obviously incriminating. But there was a door in the back marked office. Locked, but this time with a more sophisticated electronic keypad. I can bypass it, Ryan said, pulling out a device. Give me 2 minutes. While Ryan worked, Gary and Corey swept the perimeter. In the shadows near the back wall, Gary found tire tracks, heavy truck treads, recent, and something else, a single plastic bag, the kind used for transporting drugs in bulk, partially hidden under a pallet. He photographed it, didn't touch it. The lock beeped. Ryan pulled the door open. Inside the office, computers, filing cabinets, and in the back corner, a safe. Corey whistled low. This isn't a storage facility. This is a command center. Gary photographed everything, careful not to disturb anything. Then he noticed a desk calendar, marked with dates and abbreviated codes. He recognized one. The date Rex had broken into his house had a note. RS. Handled. Another date from 2 months prior. CW. Product moved. CW. Cameron Whitney, the dealer Ed mentioned. And there, in neat handwriting, a list of names under the heading payroll. Norman Phillips, Bill Campos, Willard Pratt, the code enforcement officer, and 6 others, all county employees. Dan Swanson's corruption wasn't just tolerating dealers. He was running the entire operation. We need to go, Corey said urgently. Get this to Michael. Let him make it official. They slipped out, relocked the entrance, disappeared into the night. Michael had everything documented from outside. Their entry, their exit, timestamps. Enough for a federal warrant based on suspicious activity at a suspected drug facility. But as they drove away, Gary saw headlights in the rearview mirror. A black Tahoe, light bar on top. Sheriff Dan Swanson, personally trailing them. Shit, Ryan muttered. He knew we'd come. Ed, Gary realized. Dan found out he talked to us. His phone rang. It was Ed Matthews, voice tight with fear. My house. They're here. Dan and Phillips. They're taking me in, saying I'm under investigation for corruption. It's bullshit. They're silencing me. My wife is. The line went dead. Gary looked at Corey and Ryan. They're burning their own people to cover their tracks. We need to move faster. Michael can get the warrant expedited, Corey said. With Ed's testimony and what we documented tonight, FBI can move by tomorrow. If Ed survives that long, Gary said grimly. He made a decision, one that would either end this or make it much worse. He called Jake, file an emergency motion, immediate restraining order against Sheriff Dan Swanson and his deputies, alleging witness intimidation and corruption. Make it public. Get to every news outlet in California. I want this in the open where Dan can't operate in shadows. That's declaring war, Jake said. War was declared when he arrested me for defending my family, Gary replied. Now we're taking the fight to him. Chapter 6, The Trap Springs. The next morning, the story broke statewide. Corrupt sheriff accused of running drug operation. Jake had leaked the information to journalists he trusted, and they'd run with it. Photos of the warehouse, Ed Matthews' allegations, a timeline of suspicious case dismissals. Dan Swanson's career was imploding in real time. Gary watched the news in his living room, Samantha beside him. His phone buzzed constantly. Michael confirming FBI agents were en route to secure the warehouse. Valerie reporting that 3 more deputies had come forward with information. Ryan saying Cameron Whitney had been picked up at the border trying to flee to Mexico. But Dan Swanson remained at large. He's going to come for you, Samantha said quietly. He's got nothing left to lose now. I know. That's what I'm counting on. Gary had learned long ago that the most effective way to neutralize a threat wasn't to wait for them to strike. It was to control the battlefield, to force them to fight on your terms. He'd spent the last 2 days preparing this house like a firebase. Cameras at every entrance, motion sensors, reinforced locks. Corey and Ryan were positioned in strategic locations around the property, hidden but ready. Michael was coordinating with FBI agents in town, ready to respond. And Gary himself sat in his living room, visible through the window, apparently alone. The bait. At 3 p.m., a text from Ryan. 2 vehicles approaching. Dan's Tahoe and a civilian truck. For men total. Gary texted back. Hold position. Let them make the first move. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, made himself visible. Wanted Dan to see him through the windows, calm and unafraid. Outside, car door slammed. Footsteps on gravel. Then Dan Swanson's voice through a bullhorn. Gary Robinson. This is the sheriff. Come out with your hands visible. You're wanted for questioning in connection with evidence tampering and breaking and entering. Gary stepped onto his porch. Dan stood in his driveway, Norman Phillips beside him, 2 other men Gary didn't recognize. Not deputies, probably off-duty or hired muscle. All 4 were armed. I'm not going anywhere with you, Dan, Gary called. FBI has your warehouse. They have your dealer. They have Deputy Matthews' testimony. It's over. Ed Matthews is a liar and a traitor, Dan shouted. And you're a vigilante who thinks he's above the law. Both of you are going down. The law is coming for you. Real law, not your corrupted version. You've got maybe an hour before federal agents arrive with arrest warrants. Dan's face twisted. Then I've got an hour to settle accounts. He drew his service weapon. It was the moment Gary had anticipated, the one that separated a strategic mind from a panicked reaction. Dan was past the point of legal maneuvering, past trying to use his badge as cover. He was now just a desperate man with a gun. You pull that trigger, Gary said evenly. You won't leave this property alive. And not because of me. You threatening me? Stating a fact. Look around, Dan. Dan did, and saw them. Corey stepping out from behind the workshop, rifle raised. Ryan on the roof of the house, scoped, weapon trained down. And approaching up the driveway, 3 black SUVs with FBI emblazoned on the sides. Michael had accelerated the timeline. Special Agent Valerie Hodge stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 6 other agents, all armed, all focused on Dan and his men. Sheriff Daniel Swanson, Valerie announced, voice carrying across the property. You're under arrest for drug trafficking, corruption, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. Drop your weapon and get on the ground. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Dan still had his gun drawn, trained on Gary. Norman Phillips had his hand on his own weapon. The 2 other men looked ready to bolt. Then Dan's shoulders slumped. He lowered his weapon, let fall to the gravel. It's over, Gary said quietly. You came after my family, and you lost. FBI agents swarmed forward, cuffing Dan and his associates. Valerie approached Gary. We found enough evidence in that warehouse to charge him with running a drug distribution network that brought in over $10 million in the last 3 years. Cameron Whitney is cooperating, naming names. And Deputy Matthews' testimony corroborates everything. What about Ed? Is he safe? He's in federal custody. So is his family. Dan sent Phillips to threaten them, but we got there first. Gary watched as they loaded Dan into the SUV. The sheriff looked back at him, eyes full of hate. This isn't over, Robinson. I have friends. Lawyers. You'll go to prison, Gary interrupted, for a very long time. And your son will learn what you should have taught him. Actions have consequences. As the FBI convoy drove away, Samantha emerged from the house, running to embrace her father. It's over? Really over? For Dan, yes. We still have to deal with the preliminary hearing, my assault charge. But with Ed's testimony and the evidence of Dan's retaliation, Jake says it'll be dismissed. Corey and Ryan joined them, along with Michael. They'd won. Not just a tactical victory, but a systemic one, exposing corruption, protecting a community. Beer's on me, Corey said. Gunny, you just took down a cartel operation with 5 guys and a plan. Delta Force would be proud. But Gary was looking at Samantha, seeing the relief in her eyes, the weight lifting off her shoulders. That's what mattered. Not the operation, not the victory, keeping his daughter safe. Actually, Gary said, I need to check on someone first. Chapter 7. Consequences. The county hospital's recovery ward was quiet at 4 p.m. Gary walked past nurses who recognized him from news coverage. Some nodded respectfully, others looked away. He found room 217, knocked softly. Rex Swanson lay in bed, elevated slightly, legs motionless under white sheets. He looked smaller than he had that night, diminished. The arrogant threat in his eyes replaced by something emptier. "You," Rex said, voice hoarse. "Come to finish me off?" "Came to talk." "About what?" "How you ruined my life. Crippled me." Gary pulled up a chair, sat. "You ruined your own life, Rex. You broke into my home with a knife. You threatened my daughter. What happened to you was a consequence of choices you made. That's easy for you to say. You're walking. His voice broke. I'm never going to walk again. Never going to run, drive, have a normal life. No, you're not. And I'm sorry for that. I controlled that takedown as carefully as I could, but physics is physics. Your momentum, the stairs, I couldn't prevent all of it." Rex stared at the ceiling. "My dad said he'd fix it. Said he'd make you pay. Make everything right. But he's arrested now, isn't he? I saw it on the news. Drug trafficking. Corruption. They're saying he ran the whole operation. Did you know?" Gary asked. "That he was dirty?" "Yeah, I knew. Not the details, but I knew where the money came from. The house, the boat, all of it. And I knew he protected me. Every time I screwed up, every fight, every arrest, he made it go away." Rex's hands clenched the sheets. "He made me weak. He never made me face what I did. Never made me grow up." There was something in Rex's voice, not quite remorse, but the beginning of understanding. "What are you going to do now?" Gary asked. "What can I do? I'm paralyzed. You're alive. You can think, speak, use your hands. That's more than a lot of people have. You can choose to be better than you were." Rex laughed bitterly. "Better? I terrorized your daughter. Broke into your home. You think I can just be better and that fixes it? No, but you can start. The prosecutor wants to charge you with attempted assault, breaking and entering, violating a restraining order. You're looking at 10 years minimum. Or you can cooperate, testify about your father's influence, take responsibility for your actions, and maybe get a reduced sentence with mandatory counseling." "Why would you care if I get counseling?" "Because I'm a father," Gary said, "and I see what your father did to you. Enabled your worst instincts, protected you from consequences, turned you into what you are. That's not justice, that's abuse. You have a chance to break that cycle." Rex turned his head away, but Gary saw tears on his cheeks. "I'm sorry," Rex whispered. "For Samantha. For everything. I was so angry, so entitled. I thought if I scared her enough, she'd come back to me. I didn't even think about what I was doing to her. Tell that to her. And mean it. Because the real test isn't apologizing to me. It's facing the person you hurt and owning what you did." Gary stood to leave. "Robinson," Rex called. "Your daughter. Is she okay?" "She will be," Gary said. "We both will be." Chapter 8. Trial by Fire. The preliminary hearing came 3 weeks later, but the landscape had shifted entirely. With Sheriff Dan Swanson in federal custody, his entire department was under investigation. 5 deputies had been arrested, including Norman Phillips. Cameron Whitney had cut a deal, provided evidence of Dan's operation going back 7 years. The assault charge against Gary was formally dropped, with the district attorney issuing a public apology for the wrongful prosecution. But Dan Swanson still had one card to play. Gary sat in the courtroom gallery, watching as Dan's attorney, a slick Los Angeles lawyer named Stephen Dalton, argued for bail. Dan had been denied twice already, but Dalton was persistent. "Your Honor," Dalton said, "my client is a decorated law enforcement officer with 30 years of service. The allegations against him are based largely on the testimony of a disgraced deputy with a grudge and a career criminal attempting to reduce his own sentence. Sheriff Swanson deserves the opportunity to prepare his defense from a position of freedom." Judge Faye Hartman looked unimpressed. "Mr. Dalton, the evidence against your client includes financial records showing over $3 million in unexplained deposits, testimony from 7 current and former law enforcement officers, and physical evidence recovered from a warehouse your client visited repeatedly. This isn't a case built on hearsay. Nevertheless, Sheriff Swanson is not a flight risk. He attempted to intimidate witnesses and threatened a federal investigation. He's demonstrated he's a danger to the community." Judge Hartman banged her gavel. "Bail is denied. Trial is set for 6 months from now." As they led Dan out, He looked directly at Gary, mouthed something. "This isn't over." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Gary ignored them, but Jake stepped forward to make a statement. "My client, Gary Robinson, acted in lawful self-defense when protecting his daughter from a violent home invasion. The subsequent persecution he suffered at the hands of a corrupt sheriff only underscores the importance of accountability in law enforcement. We are gratified that justice is being served." Later, at Gary's house, the core team gathered one last time. Ed Matthews was there, looking healthier, no longer carrying the weight of compromised duty. He'd been offered a position with the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. His experience inside Dan's operation made him valuable. "Rex is cooperating with prosecutors," Jake reported. "He's agreed to testify about his father's protection and enablement. In exchange, he'll get 7 years with eligibility for parole and 4 mandatory psychological counseling and restitution to victims." "What about Samantha?" Valerie asked. "How's she handling all this?" "Better," Gary said. "She started seeing a counselor, processing the trauma. She's back in school, talking about finishing her degree. And Rex sent her a letter, handwritten apology, no excuses. She hasn't responded, doesn't know if she will, but at least he tried." "And you?" Corey asked. "What's next for you, Gunny?" Gary considered. A month ago, he'd been a retired Marine building furniture. Now he'd dismantled a corrupt law enforcement network, exposed a drug operation, and protected his daughter from multiple threats. "I'm going back to what I was doing," he said. "Building furniture, spending time with Sam. But I'm also talking to the state police about consulting on tactical training for their academies. Turns out there's demand for someone who can teach both the physical skills and the ethical framework." "Teaching again," Michael said, smiling. "Back to your roots. Someone has to make sure the next generation knows the difference between power and authority, between a badge that protects and one that oppresses." They talked into the night, old warriors reliving the mission, analyzing what went right and what could have gone wrong. But underneath it all, Gary felt the satisfaction of a job completed, an enemy defeated, not just tactically, but morally. Dan Swanson had tried to use his power to destroy anyone who threatened his control. Instead, he'd lost everything: career, freedom, respect, legacy. And Gary Robinson had proven that some things, family, honor, justice, were worth fighting for, even when the system failed. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 6 months later, Gary stood in the garage workshop, sanding down the last piece of oak for Samantha's bookshelf. The one he'd been building when this all started, interrupted by violence and corruption and necessity. Now, finally, he could finish it. Samantha walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Dad, you've been out here for 3 hours." "Last piece," Gary said, examining the grain. "After this, I'll help you move it into your new apartment." She found a place closer to the university, a fresh start. The restraining order against Rex was permanent, though from what Gary heard, Rex was focused on his own rehabilitation, working with an adaptive sports program, learning to navigate his new reality. "I heard from Jake," Samantha said. "Dan Swanson's trial starts next week. They're expecting it to last 3 weeks, and the prosecution is confident." "Good. You're not going to attend?" Gary shook his head. "That part's over for me. The system's doing its job now. Federal prosecutors, honest judges, evidence-based law. My job was to expose the corruption and protect you. Everything after that is someone else's responsibility." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee. Outside, kids played in a neighbor's yard, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. "I've been thinking about what you said," Samantha finally spoke, "about consequences and choices. I spent so long blaming myself for Rex, wondering what I did to make him violent, to make him obsessed. But he made his choices. His father enabled them, and you stopped them before it got worse. You're not responsible for someone else's actions, only your own. I know that now, and I've been making my own choices: therapy, school, this new apartment. I'm building my life the way I want it, not reacting to threats or fear." Gary smiled. "Your mother would be proud. She called yesterday, said she saw the news, wanted to make sure I was okay." Samantha paused. "I told her about everything, how you protected me, how you dismantled Dan's operation. She said, I always knew your father was dangerous when he needed to be, but I never understood he could be dangerous in the right way. What does that mean? That power without morality is just violence. But power with morality, that's protection. That's justice. That's what you showed me. The bookshelf was finished. They loaded it into Gary's truck, drove to Samantha's new apartment. As they assembled it in her living room, other pieces of her life coming together around them, Gary felt the weight of the last 6 months finally lifting. His phone buzzed. A text from Corey. Her Dan got 22 years federal. Phillips got 15. Cameron Whitney in witness protection. Good guys won. Gary texted back. We did our job. That's all. But another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Mr. Robinson, this is Rex. I saw the trial verdict. My father's going to prison. Part of me is angry, but mostly I'm relieved. He can't protect me anymore. Can't enable me. I have to face what I did and who I was. Thank you for that. I know it sounds insane, but by stopping me that night, by being strong enough to do what needed to be done, you saved my life too. I'm learning to be better. It's slow, but it's real. Rex Swanson. Gary showed the text to Samantha. What are you going to say? She asked. Nothing. That's his journey now, not mine. But I'm glad he's on it. They finished assembling the bookshelf. It stood solid and level, every joint perfect, every surface smooth. The project that had been interrupted by violence was now complete, a symbol of something built carefully, with skill and patience. That evening, as Gary drove home, he passed the Meridian Falls Sheriff's Department. There was a new interim sheriff, appointed by the state until special elections could be held. The department was being rebuilt from the ground up, new leadership, new standards, new accountability. The county was healing. At home, Gary stood on his porch, looking out at the property he'd turned into a battlefield and then reclaimed. The camera's and motion sensors were still there, but now they were just precautions, not preparation for war. His phone rang. Valerie Hodge. Gary, I wanted to let you know. The State Attorney General's office is using the Meridian Falls case as a template for investigating corruption in rural law enforcement across California. Ed Matthews is heading up the task force. They're calling it the Swanson Protocol, systematic investigation of departments with unusual case dismissal rates, financial audits of elected sheriffs, protection for whistleblowers. That's good work, Gary said. It's your work. You exposed this. You showed that one person standing up can make a difference. After she hung up, Gary sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills orange and gold. He thought about the 17 years he'd spent teaching young Marines how to be warriors, not just how to fight, but when to fight, why to fight, how to carry that violence with honor. He'd always told them, your strength isn't measured by how many people you can hurt, but by how many you can protect. The moment you use power for personal gain or vengeance, you've lost your honor. He'd lived that principle. When Dan Swanson came for his family, Gary hadn't responded with mindless violence or revenge. He'd used his skills, his connections, his tactical mind, but always within moral bounds, always for protection, always for justice. Dan Swanson was in prison not because Gary destroyed him, but because Gary exposed him and let the system do its job. That was the difference between a warrior and a thug. Inside, Gary made dinner, cleaned his weapons, did the small maintenance tasks that kept life ordered. Tomorrow he'd start building a dining table for a client, a young couple expecting their first child. Life continued, projects accumulated, the world kept turning. But he also cleaned his go bag, checked his emergency cash in the rafters, maintained the systems that kept him ready. Because he'd learned long ago that peace wasn't the absence of threats. It was the preparedness to meet them. Gary Robinson had been a Marine, an instructor, a father. He taught hundreds of men how to be dangerous in the service of something greater than themselves. And when his own test came, when his daughter's life hung in the balance, he'd passed it. Not because he was the strongest or the most violent, but because he understood that true strength was measured in the precision of its application. 45 seconds. That's all it took to stop Rex Swanson. 6 months. That's how long it took to dismantle a corrupt empire. A lifetime. That's how long it would take to rebuild trust in a system that had failed. But it was a lifetime Gary Robinson was committed to, one project, one lesson, one act of protection at a time. The furniture he built would hold books and memories. The Marines he trained would protect the innocent. And the daughter he'd saved would grow strong and free, knowing that when darkness came, someone who loved her had been ready. That was enough. That was everything. Epilogue. 1 year later, Gary received an invitation to speak at the Marine Corps Instructor Training Symposium at Quantico. The topic, ethical application of combat skills in civilian life. He stood before 200 instructors from various special operations units, telling them the story, not as a war story, but as a case study in restraint, preparation, and moral clarity. When I faced Rex Swanson, Gary said, I had 3 options: shoot him, which was legally justified but would have ended a life unnecessarily; let him attack, which would have endangered my daughter and myself; or control the situation with the minimum force necessary, which is what I did. The consequences were severe, but they were proportional to his actions, not my anger. He paused, looking at the young faces before him. You will train thousands of warriors in your careers. Teach them to be lethal, yes, but more importantly, teach them to be moral. Teach them that true strength is in the control, not the execution. And teach them that when they return to civilian life, they carry a responsibility to protect the weak, expose corruption, and stand for justice, even when the system fails. The applause was genuine. Afterward, a young instructor approached, a woman, mid-20s, smart eyes. Gunny Robinson? I'm Lieutenant Faye Hartman. I wanted you to know, I was one of the Marines you trained 7 years ago. You probably don't remember me, but you changed my life. Taught me that being a warrior wasn't about aggression. It was about discipline. Gary smiled. I remember. You had the fastest hip toss in your class. She laughed. You taught me more than martial arts. You taught me honor. And when I saw what you did in Meridian Falls, how you faced corruption without becoming corrupt yourself, it reinforced everything you taught me. What are you doing now? I'm training female recruits, teaching them that they can be just as dangerous, just as capable as any man, but also teaching them your lessons about restraint, morality, protection. Then my job's done, Gary said. The next generation is teaching the next generation. That's how we build a better world. Flying home that night, Gary looked out the plane window at the lights of America spread below him. Somewhere down there, Dan Swanson sat in a federal prison, his empire destroyed, his legacy ruined. Somewhere else, Rex Swanson worked with a physical therapist, learning to navigate a world that would never again bend to his will. And in a small town in California, Samantha Robinson studied criminal justice, planning to become a prosecutor who'd fight for victims like herself. The story had ended. The good guys had won. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. And Gary Robinson, the man who'd started it all by walking empty-handed toward a knife, went home to build furniture and prepare for whatever threats tomorrow might bring. Because that's what warriors do. They build, they protect, they stand ready. Always.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.